Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Derek Haim, OCT, and I am the Registrar and CEO of the Ontario College of Teachers. I will begin by recognizing that the college offices stand on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that the City of Toronto was covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Tonight, we have gathered for a vital discussion about a systemic issue that takes a daily toll on the lives of people in our communities, workplaces, and classrooms. And of course, it has a direct impact on many of you. As Ontario's teaching regulator, the college puts the safety and well being of students first and foremost. That means every student. That also means ensuring, making it clear that there is zero tolerance for hatred or discrimination of any kind within the teaching profession. Every form of discrimination or hatred has its own history and unique impacts on those who are affected by it. Anti Black racism is no different. So while I remain saddened by its necessity, I'm enormously proud of our recently released professional advisory on anti Black racism. It offers Ontario certified teachers an updated understanding of the roots and systemic nature of anti Black racism and illustrates the impacts of its lingering presence in learning spaces. At the college, we lead when it's appropriate and we follow and listen when it's needed. For me, Black History Month is a time to listen. It's a time to engage with the personal experiences of those who are living representatives of the history this month celebrates. Joining us tonight are three special guests who have generously offered their time to guide us through some of these experiences. First, I am honored to introduce two students, Darlene Joseph and Yusuf Mohammed. Thank you so much for being with us this evening to share your lived experiences. Finally, our host for the evening and the lead writer of our professional advisory, Emerald Saunders Ndah. She is currently the principal of Amaral and Company, as well as a partner and equity, diversity, and inclusion lead at KBRS. She has served in many senior management roles in the public and private sectors, where she has cultivated a well deserved reputation as a stalwart champion of equality and opportunity. A sincere thank you to all three of our guests for being here tonight. Now, as I promised earlier, it is time for me to listen. Over to you, Amaral.
Thank you so much, Derek, and welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to be part of this conversation with you this evening, and I am also delighted that Darlene and Yusuf will be joining me in conversation. So, welcome. And it is not lost on me that we're having this conversation during this Black History Month. I've heard it called Black Futures Month as well. And it also is significant that the theme for this year's Black History Month is February and forever, which means certainly we should be talking about these issues during this month. But let's not forget about them after Monday. Let's continue to have these conversations on a regular basis. I welcome that opportunity and thank you for giving it to me. So, if you could start the backdrop, please, the presentation, I'd appreciate it. When I took on the task of drafting the professional advisory on anti Black racism, I worked hard to make sure that my affinity bias, showing preference for people who are similar to me, wouldn't impact the content in a way that caused defensiveness, anger, resentment. Of course, the process wouldn't allow that, but it helped to be mindful in any case. There's a plethora of information available on bias, whether conscious or unconscious, explicit or implicit. Perhaps you've done some reading, taken a course, participated in a seminar, or listened in on a webinar. Today, I want to do something different. I want to tell you stories about how bias shows up for us and for students and their families in particular. With this approach, I hope it will offer some insights into the lived experience of students who are adversely impacted by bias in the learning environment. As the professional advisory states, the goal is to provide support in creating inclusive and supporting learning cultures that benefit all students, regardless of their identity. My story and the accompanying slideshow are meant to pique your interest in learning more and perhaps taking a different approach to teaching, administering, counseling, and supporting students, especially those who are adversely impacted by bias. I'm also excited, as I mentioned earlier, that Darlene and Youssef will also share their stories with you this evening. Bias. We all have it. It's a part of who we are as humans. I'm often asked to conduct training on eliminating unconscious bias. And my response is always, we can't eliminate unconscious bias. It is inherent in how we think and respond to conditions and situations around us. What I can do is provide information about unconscious bias and how we can work to manage and mitigate its potentially harmful effects. The Ontario Human Rights Commission defines bias as the predisposition, prejudice, or generalization about a group of persons based on personal characteristics or stereotypes. It is the use of stereotypes to form preconceived judgments, expectations about people's capabilities and characteristics that leads to harmful outcomes, especially for Black students. These stereotypes, judgments, assumptions, thoughts are heavily influenced by the way we were socialized. What was the conversation at the dinner table like about the foreigners who moved in across the street? My exposure to bias as a student in the public education system began with my mom fighting with the school about putting me back a grade. I had recently immigrated from Jamaica, and the school wanted to put me in grade 3 instead of grade 4, a systemic barrier, a discriminatory practice that adversely impacts students, particularly those from the global south, like the Caribbean. We now call it the racism of low expectations. It could have been conformity bias. People from the third world countries don't perform well, so we should automatically put them in a lower grade. My mom insisted that I be tested instead of making an automatic assumption that I would not be able to achieve well in the right grade. Not only did I ace the test, I became the teacher's helper. Oh, did I mention that I graduated at the top of my class in every year and was my high school valedictorian? The type of education we receive also impacts how we make quick and biased assumptions. Where in Canadian textbooks do we learn about Black history or about the accomplishments of Black Canadians? Let's see. There's the Underground Railroad, there's Lincoln Alexander, there's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh, yeah, and Harriet Tubman. So a blend of Canadian and American content. But you know what? I had no idea who Viola Desmond was until she showed up on the $10 bill. Our biased views are also impacted by the media we consume. What images are reinforced by the shows we stream, the films we watch, the newspapers we read? Brad Pitt versus Mahershala Ali, or the show Friends versus Tyler Perry's House of Pain. I I often hold my breath when news shows lead with police are looking for. My inside voice says, please don't be black, please don't be black, please don't be black. The suspect is described as having dark complexion and was wearing dark clothing. As the mother of three sons, I am hyper aware of how these quick judgments, stereotypes, can affect my children. Do they match the description, I wonder? I ask more questions than perhaps other parents do about my children's location, their friends, their activities. I find myself using stereotypes to judge my own children. Son, you've been coming home a lot lately. What are you out doing so late at night? Have you heard what's happening in the news? To which my son will take offense. I'm offended by what you're suggesting. Why can't I just be hanging out with friends at their place? We all hold unconscious beliefs about people who are different from or even similar to us. My belief that my son is up to no good if he's breaking curfew. Unconscious bias is far more prevalent than conscious bias. Research shows that our brains are hardwired to be influenced by the unconscious. The data reveals that we receive 11 million pieces of information in a minute, but that we can only consciously process 40 of these pieces of information. Most of our decision making happens at the unconscious level. So, researchers at Harvard, MIT, the University of Illinois, and other universities in the States in the 1980s shows that almost 100% of our mental processing is determined by our unconscious mind. Pause. Think about that for a second. Let that be a part of the 40 pieces of information that you process. These unconscious beliefs, influenced by our upbringing, education, social circles, media consumption, can contribute to a culture that embraces difference and diversity or is threatened or repelled by it. Discrimination, harassment, racism, or curiosity, respect, even love. A timely new study from Harvard PhD student Mark Chin, who is in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, shows that implicit or unconscious bias is difficult to quantify because measuring it is often not part of the review that school districts and school leaders do. It's not part of the process of looking at teachers in the classroom, he says. His study reveals that the implicit biases of teachers vary significantly by the race of the individual. Remember, this is an American study, but it may have implications for Canada as well. Um, Marchin found that teachers of color were found to have lower levels of pro white, anti Black bias than white teachers, with Black teachers having the lowest levels of anti Black bias. Further, teachers with lower anti Black bias tend to work in counties or regions with more Black students. Chin said, this is a positive finding, given that you wouldn't want teachers with strong anti Black bias serving more Black students. Our results are also potentially showing an explanation for why Black students who have Black teachers have higher outcomes. He further states that hiring seems like a beneficial lever to pull, given that teachers of color have lower biases and having more leaders of color in a school might challenge the structures that perpetuate these biases in schools and districts. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different forms of bias. A quick Google search using the word bias yielded 3,310 pieces of information. That sure is a lot of information to unpack. And when taking the time to learn more about bias, It can be helpful to start small, looking for resources that are relevant to the work that you do. Let me focus on some common forms of bias. And now remember that we all have bias. So it's not about feeling badly about them. It's about being more aware of them and trying to interrupt their harmful effects if you feel that they may impact your approach to work or how you perceive certain groups. Findings from researchers show that education on its own, sadly, isn't very helpful in reducing the harmful effects of bias. It's good to discuss it in groups, seek input from others, slow down our making, question assumptions, and gather facts. In the work environment, social bias can show up by wanting to work or socialize with those who are similar to us. Maybe you went to the same school or university, worked at the same institution, or share a similar cultural background. It's that connection with people that have similar characteristics. So, in the work environment, who might be left out based on our social biases? This is where the notion of cliques are formed and the notion of the in group versus the out group shows up. So, who is going to get invited out for a drink after work when all pandemic restrictions are lifted? Information bias influences how we think about and make decisions. Sometimes we look for information to support our point of view, overlooking divergent opinions. This can influence how curriculum is developed. That Eurocentric focus that has students reading Shakespeare and Shaw as opposed to Baldwin and Morrison. We often assume that discriminatory behavior is something that is done consciously. We think that people who know better should do better, and those who don't know better often act badly. But in fact, the reality is that people usually make decisions that disadvantage one group in favor of another without noticing or realizing it. That is what unconscious bias is. The way we experience the world around us is guided by a pattern of making unconscious decisions about others based on what feels right, what feels comfortable, what is safe. Biases happen because of the way our brains rapidly categorize other people to help with the quick decision making. It's hard to process all that information about the people we meet, work with, teach, counsel, and support. So, what happens is we tend to categorize, make assumptions, and make those quick judgments. Like a tall black student, male black student must like basketball, or the Chinese student's probably good at math and science, or the Muslim student who asks for prayer space. Are they radical? This is called social categorization. According to the instructor David White on the website study.com, in the process of developing our individual or collective identities, we tend to rely heavily on social categories, which are the social groups that people are placed in based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, religion. These social groupings help us to make determinations quickly about others and sometimes ourselves, which allows us to form a general conclusion about others. Now, this approach can be helpful or harmful. It sure saves time when we're trying to process information quickly about others, but it can reinforce stereotypes, erroneous judgments, and assumptions. It's heavily biased and can be damaging when making rapid assumptions about people. This point was brought home to me when my eldest son took offense to the comment, good work, on an English test. He hadn't studied for the test, which he admitted later, and was upset. Why? It reinforced for him the racism of low expectations that perhaps his teacher had for young black male youth. He got 60% and knew that it wasn't good work. And he told the teacher that, complained to me, and asked me to intervene. In order to interrupt bias, it's necessary to avoid social characterization and take the time to get to know people on an individual level. Practice the idea of inclusion and belonging. Other forms of bias that show up in the learning environment include affinity bias, attraction to those who are similar or like us. I mentioned this at the outset when I began the process of writing the professional advisory on anti Black racism. So consider the notion of teacher's pet. I'm not sure whether that term is still in vogue or not. But I remember the teacher's pet was usually a strong academic student who conformed to every instruction given by the teacher. I've got to confess, I don't recall getting that title. Attribution bias, making judgments or assumptions about why people behave in certain ways. What judgments do we make about students who come from the priority neighborhoods, poor, low income, single parent, at risk? I recall one of my sons not wanting to go to a certain library in a community near where we live in East Scarborough because of what people said about the community and the suggestions of a prevalence of gangs. I had to remind him that the majority of people who lived in that community actually look like us. Bias. We make assumptions about people who are different than us and those who are similar to us. Another common bias that may show up in the learning environment is beauty bias. Judging people based on their appearance. The research shows that those who are perceived to be beautiful are often treated better, more fairly. A story from my son who went through the public education system. In 2018, when I was in grade 10, do-rags were seen as a form of gang relations when in reality they are used to maintain and secure hairstyles commonly used by the Black community. I argued to teachers and the office staff to allow the use of do-rags in school time after time, and I would get in trouble. And in one case, I got sent home for wearing my do-rag at lunch when I wasn't even on school property. It wasn't until I was no longer a student there for them to allow the use of do-rags. Another common bias, the halo or horn effect, perceiving someone positively based on favorable information or perceiving someone negatively based on unfavorable information. Another story from my son, Ibrahim. It was 2019. There was tension between me and my teacher during the whole school year. It was the first week after March break, and I had her class. And I waited 30 minutes, and then I asked if I may go to the washroom. To which she replied, I don't like talking to people of your kind, then brushed me away. I tried very hard to keep my cool with her, but there was a lot of built up frustration towards her. So then I confronted her about what she just said to me. The conversation did not go well, and I was brought to the office where I was told I will no longer be able to be in class for the remainder of my grade 11 year, and I should look at independent learning school for the following year. My art teacher was unpunished for the words she said to me and claimed that she was scared for her life when I was confronting her. Now, did the teacher use the horn effect on my 6'2" tall and dark complexioned son? Why did she feel scared for her life when one of her students wanted to engage in dialogue with her? Confirmation bias, looking for evidence or proof to support our views and opinions. The way to disrupt this is to encourage divergent points of view. We need to consider who we engage with inside and outside of the learning environment. What are our relationships like with diverse communities? Do we even have those relationships? Institutional or systemic biases are found in the policies, the practices, and the processes. These biases lead to discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, and unequal opportunities. What happens is, on the surface, they look neutral, but in reality, it privileges some groups and disadvantages others. The practice of streaming was a clear example of this. Or putting students in certain programs or areas of studies that we think fit their profile. My final story from Ibrahim, who was able to successfully graduate, although it took him a while, and he's still scarred by his public school experience. The principal recommended that I go to an alternative school and not to return to the school the next year. Knowing that I was the star player for their basketball program, they asked me to still be a part of the program, just not a student. I felt like that was them trying to use my talent for their basketball reputation instead of them helping me overcome my educational challenges. In 2020, I started the school year at a different school, but was a basketball player for my old team, figuring out my own way to get to games and practices on time while maintaining my grades at my new school. Whenever I visited my old school, they would tell me to wait outside the school until basketball practices or the game started. That made me feel unwelcomed and used, he said. So, where do we begin in terms of addressing the adverse impacts of bias? Some suggestions: slow down your decision making. Get different opinions and seek input from different people from different points of view. Push back on affinity bias. It's really important to have an open mind and be prepared and willing to change it. This is an opportunity to embrace diversity as an opportunity for growth. Another helpful tip is to question normalized behaviors and to learn, inquire, study, and query, and support equitable access and outcomes as a way to help dismantle systemic racism and systemic bias. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you found it helpful. And now it is my pleasure to invite Darlene and Yusuf to join me in conversation. Hi, how are you doing this afternoon, Darlene and Yusuf?
Pretty good.
I'm doing great. Yeah.
Great. So, what do you think of what I had what I had to say, what I shared? Did anything, ring true for you, resonate?
Yes, definitely. I also, as I will be sharing later, I've had a similar experience where teacher bias has affected me emotionally as well. And I felt like your son's stories were very impactful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Darlene. Yusuf?
Definitely, for me as well, a lot of your son's stories like really resonate with me. And one of my stories actually talks about the use of do-rags in school and how um, we're kind of ostracized just for wearing some specific garment for our hair.
Mhm. So it's interesting. My youngest son, who's about to turn 17 next month, having viewed the experience of his two older brothers, did say to me, "Mom, I don't want to go to public school. I want to go to private school." So I indulged his request, and he's at a private school where he's thriving and is regularly on the honor roll and is thriving academically as well as athletically. So I want to hear from you. If you can both tell me how educator bias has impacted your achievement and well-being as a Black identifying student. Who'd like to go first? Darlene?
Sure, I can go first.
Sure.
Well, as a Black identifying student, I've experienced many times where educator bias, implicit as well as explicit, has impacted not only mine, but my Black peers' achievements. Personally, I've had many teachers underestimate my academic capabilities, leading me to question my own abilities or having to convince teachers that I am worthy. For example, in elementary school, I've always been one of the few Black students in most classes. However, in grade 4 to 5, I was in a split class. I was one of 4 Black students, although at the time I had already been reading, speaking, and writing almost completely in English for more than 6 years as a Haitian immigrant to Canada. I always seemed to receive the lowest marks and lowest expectations from my teacher, regardless of how other teachers were able to recognize my interests and talents. This particular teacher never asked nor encouraged me to provide examples or sign up for contests like he did many others in my class. In fact, the other Black students in my class often felt the same way as I did. It was only in grade 10 when I finally had a Black English teacher who was able to see my abilities. Before then, I doubted everything I wrote and said. It got to the point where I barely participated in that class. It wasn't until I had this teacher that I was able to strengthen my self-confidence and access the opportunities that I have today. I also wanted to add that while underestimating like academic capabilities has left an emotional scar on me, a more aggressive form of bias I've faced is microaggressions. The specific aggression I've experienced has been the mispronunciation of my name. My name is Darlene. I've corrected many teachers repeatedly on how to pronounce my name, but to no avail. I've been told a multitude of times how I should be pronouncing the names of my non-Black friends and peers, whether it's a teacher who corrects me or my peers. However, I haven't met a non-Black teacher who's like corrected themselves, but also my peers adjust the situation when it comes to how to say or spell my name. In fact, during self-introductions, one of my teachers told me that the way my name is pronounced in English is Darlene. I know and understand that many people are named Darlene. However, the accent on my name is not for decoration, nor is it there to be ignored. It represents my identity as a Francophone Haitian. It represents my identity as a Black student in a room filled with others whose names matter just as much as mine. I wish I could return to that moment and reiterate that my name is Darlene, not Darlene. And simply acknowledging the proper pronunciation of a name without bias would comfort me and many Black students that I know who've experienced the same thing as I did.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Darlene, for sharing. And I'm sorry that you've had to have those experiences as part of your learning journey. And I can understand the emotional trauma that you experience, that self-doubt, that lack of confidence. And so your experience actually reinforces the research findings from the Harvard PhD student, Mark Chin. I also went through most of my public school, years without having a teacher who looked like me. So, I really understand your story, and thank you for sharing it. Yusuf, I ask the same question of you. How has education bias impacted your achievement and well-being as a young Black male student?
Yeah, I can definitely continue. Um, for Black students, the initial perception of their future outcome is where everything begins. Educators don't expect for Black students to have as great of an outcome in life as their peers. and this idea is drilled into our minds from primary school. They don't expect us to make the right decisions, take the right classes, or focus on the right activities. Let me give you an example. I've been enrolled in gifted education since the fourth grade, and since that time, I've only had one Black peer in any of those gifted classes. Can you imagine that? Almost an entire decade, hundreds of classmates, three different schools, and that entire time, I've only had one other individual in the class that looked like me. Usually, a teacher in the second or third grade is the one who decides that a student should be placed in gifted classes, which itself is extremely partial and subjective. Non-Black teachers' inherently biased perceptions of Black students from extremely early on play a role in how much they can achieve. I'm not saying it's impossible for us to achieve great things without being in a gifted program, but the lack of representation truly goes to show how little and how seldom we are recognized in so many contexts, and how the implicit expectations of Black students from educators affect us and diminish our ability to portray our excellence. Even before we speak a word in the classroom, we're expected to prove our worth and intelligence to our non-Black educators and peers. Another experience I can recall revolves around how Black students are often unfairly profiled, even in schools, both by teachers and other staff. One day, I decided to braid my hair into cornrows. I wore a do-rag to school in order to lay my hair down, and while walking from my second period to third period class, my third period to fourth period class, I was stopped by the hall monitor and accused of trespassing in the school. She saw a tall Black male with a do-rag on, his chain out, and a big black puffer jacket that she seemingly had not seen before in the school, and immediately assumed that I was involved in some sort of criminal activity. While she did not let me off, while she did let me off after a lengthy explanation of myself, I don't think that it's fair that I was pulled off to the side in the first place. All of a sudden, when I dress differently or do my hair a certain way, I can't exhibit non-problematic behavior. I'm sure she wouldn't have expected that I, the criminal she saw braided up with a do-rag and chain, spend my days in the library studying chemistry, and that I'm attending an Ivy League university on an academic scholarship in the fall. I find this situation accurately reflects a lot of the treatment that Black students unfairly receive at school. Oftentimes, we get in trouble or confronted for reasons that no other student would have gotten in trouble for. And even if they would have, their punishment is never nearly as harsh, and we end up becoming ostracized in the very buildings that we are told we should feel safe and welcomed in.
Wow. Very powerful, and it reinforces some of the experiences that my own children have had. And congratulations, by the way, on being accepted at Princeton. You should be suitably proud of that achievement, Yusuf. So I know that we're short on time because I could speak to both of you all evening, but time is not our friend. So my final question for the both of you would be, what advice or tips would you give to educators to ensure that they don't have those negative experiences that you unfortunately have had, and that the experiences that should be affirming of a student's identity, and the culture of the learning environment should be supportive? What advice would you have?
Um, well, I can answer this question first. I think
S'il vous plaît.
one strategy that I would really appreciate teachers doing, and it's very simple, and it's self-assessing the implicit biases we have from within. Because I know for myself, as a Black girl, I know definitely I have some biases against people, and sometimes I do have, and of course, a lot of the times they're never intentional. They're never something that you're thinking about. But when you take a step back and you go, oh, why am I thinking this way? What has led me to come this way? Is what I'm saying or what I'm thinking based on the outside influences, or because of just the way I've been, the environment that I've been brought up on, or just my own thinking? And I feel like once we're able to self-assess our own biases, I feel like that is the first step in being able to help improve the situation. And definitely soliciting feedback from students, because one of my teachers, in fact, in order to avoid situations of his biases clouding his judgment when it comes to marking or grading our work, he asks us to assess our own performance first. And so he can see how it matches up, how his perception of us and our perception of self affects the work that we're actually doing. And also cultivating an inclusive environment, like just the way you teach things, like just making sure when you address somebody, being careful of the not too delicate to the point where you're too sensitive, you're sensitizing everything, but being careful and assessing the way you address students and the topics you're going to speak about.
Thank you so much, Darlene. That's a great observation. It really begins when we're trying to manage and mitigate bias with critical self reflection and critical self awareness, doing the work on the self first to help enhance our understanding. So, thank you for those insights. I really appreciate it. Yusuf, your thoughts. What can teachers do better?
I definitely echo a lot of the thoughts that Darlene presented. And I surely encourage teachers and educators to, and even school staff to think about a time that they've had the opportunity to meet or teach a Black student and try to remember what their first impression of them was before they even spoke a word to them. And being like completely honest with yourself, if that initial perception wasn't one that you would see like a non-Black student as, to try to erase it and reassess, I guess, your own implicit biases and how you can change your initial perceptions of Black students for the future. And also considering any feedback from students that they may give you um, on any maltreatment or just any ideas they may present to improve your classroom or your learning environment. And also incorporating ideas of implicit biases into your classrooms. Like, for example, I know right now in English class, we're learning about literary lenses. And one of the lenses we're learning about is the psychoanalytic lens, um, which was sort of created by Sigmund Freud. And this lens kind of delves into your mind consciously and unconsciously. And I think uh, that, as an example, would be a really easy way to sort of incorporate how we think about things unconsciously and how they can affect um, the people that we know in our lives.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. Yes, it's important to engage in dialogue and conversation and welcome different points of view. Not only it's helpful with creating an inclusive learning environment, as you pointed out, but it can help us, change our minds, and help people feel more of a sense of belonging. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to share your lived experience. I know that perhaps there were triggers in having to recount some of the unfortunate incidents and treatments that you've experienced. And I want to take the time to wish you well and continued success on your learning journey. I think that you're both on the path to great leadership. And I wish you well when the fall comes at Princeton, Yusuf. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Goodbye.
Okay. Okay. Take care. Au revoir. Bonne nuit. Mm. And there you've experienced some lived experiences from Darlene and Yusuf. And we again thank them for their time and for being willing to share with a view to being helpful, not hurtful. So we've got about 13 minutes of time left, and I want to take that time to answer some of the questions that viewers submitted in advance of our webinar today. And I want to thank those who did submit questions. I will do my best to get to as many of them as I can. So, the first question, la première question. How can a superintendent and principal create and nurture conditions for educators to examine and promote actively um, bias in a school or a board with limited live experience of racism and anti racism? That is a great question. Thank you for that submission. I think we can learn from what our students share, what Darlene and Yusuf said. So, including new and different types of materials into the curriculum, engaging with diverse communities, and perhaps reaching out to experts, to subject matter experts, to members from traditionally marginalized or equity deserving groups who may be willing to work with the superintendent and the principal to help create conditions that are nurturing and supportive. We need to look at this from a holistic and collaborative perspective when we're talking about the journey of learning. It really takes partnership. So we're working with parents, caregivers, um, family members, the community organizations, as well as learners and administrators in wanting to set up the conditions so that all students, can succeed. So it is doing some outreach, looking for support. There's a lot of information that's available online. You can also start with the information that's available on OCT's website as well. And approach it, I always say, with humility by saying, there's a lot to do. We have a lot to learn, and, we respectfully seek help and support, and then compensating people for their time and expertise, and not assuming that by compensation, that's necessarily a monetary type of exchange. It may be, giving people space. Ask them, what does support or compensation look like, instead of making assumptions around that. I hope you found those insights helpful. The next question: how do you bring up race and bias in early elementary grades? It's so important to start early in the conversation when we're trying to create culturally competent students. We have to begin early. The research shows that the earlier the better. I think I read one research study that showed that um, babies as early as 9 months can start to make judgments about people. Like if you pass, the baby to someone, to a stranger, like who are they more inclined to cry with based on images that they may have seen? So, where to begin? I know even Sesame Street addresses, racism and diversity and inclusion. There are materials available online that talk about having these types of conversations at a very early age. So, there are television shows, there are books, there are articles, and take advantage of awareness months, celebratory months like Black History Month to include it even very early in young grades, to talk about, you know, Black Canadian history. And it doesn't just have to be in February. So engage students early and often, and think about how you can leverage some of these special awareness months. Or, take them on field trips to, a museum that focuses, let's say, on Indigenous history. There's a lot of ways that you can talk about race and bias early, and there are materials available to support the conversation and to support the learning. We should not avoid it. The earlier, the better. The next question: how can we collaborate with our school community to build understanding and appreciation of all student identities? How can I show that I honor and value each of my students' identities, their similarities and differences? And how can we move toward cultural responsiveness in a more intentional way in both our practices and in our curriculum? So, fantastic questions. And Darlene and Yusuf, I think, spoke about it. So, um, making sure that the space feels safe. start start with, acknowledging and recognizing the correct pronunciation of a student's name, honoring that identity, embracing difference. I recall, I still do remember my high school English teacher, who was also my theater arts teacher, Mr. Michael Smith. I still remember him. He had a positive impact on me. And when I noted that there's not a lot of diversity in the books that you've selected for us to read in English, he gave me permission to introduce new authors. And I brought in James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. And that that still, like, oh my goodness, 30 years later, resonates with me. I still recall my junior high school math teacher who created an environment of inclusiveness and learning and helped me so much with my self confidence. He's 89 years old, and we had breakfast together a couple of months ago. So the more that we show care and intentionality with our students, and we value who they are and we support their identity, you can't imagine the positive impacts that that can has, and that it's a life altering experience, and it stays with you for life. I can still see, my teachers, those teachers who positively influenced me, and I'm still in touch with a few of them. So think of the negative ramifications if we're not actually being intentional. Think about Darlene's story and how the fact that she felt disrespected in the space and how that adversely impacted her schooling for at least 6 years until she found a teacher who honored her identity. It really is thinking of the classroom as a shared space. I think of the late great Bell Hooks, who talks about, sharing space and thinking that we're all sort of equal contributors to learning, and to disrupt that power dynamic by creating the inclusive spaces. If we start to do that with an openness, with an intentionality, I think that's how change happens, and that's how we work towards cultural responsiveness. The next question: how can educators contribute to dismantling racism and discriminatory barriers in schools? Wow, that's a heavy question. Um, there are concerted efforts that are happening right now. Let's look to the college to begin with. Really leaning in to the materials and resources that are available. There are a lot of efforts and initiatives that are occurring. The Anti-Black Racism Advisory is a great place to start. The additional qualification program that is beginning is another way. Taking a look at what other jurisdictions and school boards may be doing, being intentional about it, setting goals and measuring the goals, measuring your progress. So if there's a desire to shift curriculum, change curriculum, let's talk about how to do that. There certainly have been promises, charters signed, statements, posted, policed, enhanced, or or created. And now I think what communities are looking for is the action piece, because, we can rest on our laurels and be really comfortable and enjoy the power and privilege of the positions we have, or we can use that power and privilege to actually intentionally dismantle some of the systemic barriers to an inclusive learning environment. And so the notion of being patient, change will come, is not going to work much longer. You can see this current generation of learners, they're very, very intentional, and are holding us to account, to act and to, put our money where our mouths are. So, one last question. I'm going to respond to it in 30 seconds because I am mindful of time. And it's an important question, the last question. How does one stress the importance of anti racism education in a rural, primarily white community? I think that's important, particularly in homogenous communities, because you'll likely get visitors at, at some point or another. Diversity will come. Start with learning all you can about anti racism practice. Um, you know, invest in learning, in education, in growth, and perhaps you might want to, connect with other, neighboring communities or other communities where diversity is more present, and create dialogue and exchange with a view to deepening, your knowledge. I think the work of anti-racism impacts all of us regardless of our location. And so it's important to invest. You could do it incrementally, but one should not think, because we're in a homogenous community, that this work does not impact us, because it does. Thank you.
Well, what an illuminating and powerful conversation. I was almost forgetting to unmute myself and turn on my microphone because I was still pondering so many of the excellent points. I can't thank the three of you enough for being so generous with your stories and your sense of spirit. Um, there were so many highlights for me tonight. First of all, I can't believe an hour has passed already, but the wisdom, intelligence, the clearly described, bravely shared lived experience expressed by our esteemed presenters have and will continue to help me, um, make me more aware of my unconscious bias, help me to avoid the halo horn effect, remind me to be aware of and check my privilege, and acknowledge when I am saying and doing consciously racist things such as microaggressions, and also for me to invite others to ultimately help me interrupt my racist behavior. It will remind me to be more active in dismantling systemic racism. I'm still pondering Darlene's observation regarding the risk of being perceived as being disingenuous by expressing oneself in an overly sensitized way. I think that's a brilliant point. I've really never thought of that. And I'm going to have to think about that more. Um, it's clear that we have a lot of work ahead if we are to collectively build a fair, more just society. Evenings like this are not an end point, but certainly another step along that path. I'm really grateful to everyone who took time out of their day to make this possible. All of you in the audience, of course, are esteemed presenters. And I'd like to give a shout out in particular to Ryan and Melissa for the incredible behind the scenes organization and support. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.